When the United States started industrializing and urbanizing, we started back in the early 1800s. And so we have had generations to adapt to a more urbanized environment. And so we have this middle step where we went from farms to small towns to big towns to cities, and the cities have suburbs. And so there's always been a degree of elbow room put into the American model, which lowers the opportunity cost of having children. China didn't start to urbanize until 1980, and then they did it all at once. So people in a single generation went from living on a subsistence farm to a high-rise condo. And so they went from having 7 kids to 1 kid in 1 generation. The one-child policy was on top of that. And now that it's been more than 40 years, they don't have a lot of people aged under 40. There's no one left to have the next generation. So this was always going to be the last generation for the People's Republic. It was always going to be a 2-generation experience total. But it's happened so fast that we don't even have an economic theory developed. Humankind does not have an economic theory for what would allow the Chinese economy to function in 2030. It's that far gone. In the United States, we are a large population, 330 million. In order to round out our younger age groups, we really need to bring in about 2 to 4 million immigrants a year. And we're well under that right now, and that is something that will come back to bite us again and again and again in the decades to come. But we're also a settler society. None of us are actually from here. And so the United States is capable politically of sustaining large volumes of immigration for an extended period of time. Just now is not one of those moments. Immigration can be part of our solution. There's a lot of complications in that conversation, politically, logistically. That's a different conversation we can get into if you want to. But the United States is the largest economy in the world with the greatest upward mobility from people from the lower classes to the higher classes, and the attractiveness of that system, especially since it's mostly free, is robust. And you're right, that when we do decide to have an open immigration system, we usually have no problem drawing in people, and that's before you consider what's about to happen to the wider world, where the delta between the US and everyone else is going to be huge. There's 3 reasons that won't work. Number 1 is scale. The United States has over 300 million people. The Chinese have about 1.3 billion. So to move the needle, you don't just need to bring in 3 times as many people. You need to bring in 10 times as many people under age 40. It's not clear that there are enough people that are potentially migrant to salvage just China, assuming no one else moves anywhere else. Number 2, the United States has developed an interesting reputation of late of being a little bit racist, with white people being a little sketchy. But in China, which is 90% Han Chinese, they are blindingly racist to anyone who is not Han. And to think that there are going to be incentives that will draw people, especially in numbers, to the PRC is ridiculous, even before you consider the disconnect in terms of economic activity. But third, there's the governing system. You know, the US may be a flawed democracy, but a democracy it still is. China is a country where you are welded into your room when there's a health crisis. Casual dismissal, the very concept that private citizens have agency or interests, is something that does not attract migrants. Yeah, China has never had net inward migration. It's always been outward, people trying to get out, not people trying to get in. Now, there is migration within the Chinese system. People forget that China is not a traditional nation state, it is an empire, and they have expanded out and conquered other groups, and you do get migrant from those poorer minorities into the urban centers. But again, you can only do that once, because then you've hollowed out the countryside, and that is what has happened writ large throughout the entire system at this point. Remember that there are 2 things you need for globalization to work. Number 1, you need the physical interconnectivity, the transport systems that are low cost and very, very safe. The cost of transport per unit, the more steps you get in your supply chain, the greater capacity there is to expand into things that otherwise would be so low cost that you wouldn't trade them internationally. Things like wheat, for example, or plastics. Second, you need a balance of production and consumption, and that in many ways is a subset of demographic structures. So you need to have a significant number of people in your 40s, 50s, and early 60s in order to generate the capital and the skilled labor base to produce, but then you also need a lot of people in their 20s and 30s to do some of the lower skilled stuff as well as consume. And this all has to be in balance for it to work. The demographic aging we've seen in recent decades means that that second piece is just completely gone. And countries are increasingly finding it in their best interest to kind of hoard what consumption they do have and not allow trade access to it, and then producing more locally. We were moving this way before the Ukraine war, before the Chinese started to break down, and before the German industrial model started to implode. This has just sped everything up. As for the first end with transport, we're kind of in this hanging moment where we're waiting for someone to take the first shot, now that the Americans lack the capacity to protect the system. But even if we don't get a formal conflict over transport, by everyone kind of hoarding the production and consumption zones for themselves, we no longer have a vested interest anywhere in the world in what happens over the horizon. And as long as that is the case, we can get regional transport breakdowns that, from our point of view, don't affect us. But from everyone else's point of view, it's a bit of a disaster. And the more linked in your country is to these networks, the more vulnerable you are. So China, Korea, Germany, very much so at the very top of that list for different reasons. But they're all dependent upon the inflow and outflow. And so you can damage global transport significantly before the Americans really notice. Not only is the United States one of the world's biggest mining countries for raw materials, so is Canada, so is Mexico. Brazil isn't that far away, and it's all in the same hemisphere. So you can have an Eastern Hemispheric breakdown, which today, 3/4 of population, 3/4 of energy, 3/4 of food production, 3/4 of manufactured goods. And for the most part, the Western Hemisphere actually does better. The smartphone industry is probably simultaneously the most sophisticated and spread out in terms of globalization and manufacturing, and the most vulnerable.
That's why I picked it.
Yeah, fair enough. So the iPhone has 1,400 supply chain steps that touch 50 different countries. So you'll get the plastics probably from a precursor material that comes from the United States. You'll get the copper probably from Chile, but it's probably processed in China. It's probably built into an integrated circuit in Taiwan, with the design happening in California. And the system on a chip that kind of ties it all together is probably from Japan, but it is made out of components from throughout Southeast Asia, and so on and so on and so on. You miss one of these, you don't have a phone. What Apple has discovered under Tim Cook, Tim Cook was brought in to operationalize the supply chain to make it the most efficient it could be. And in doing so, 90% of those supply chain steps now in some way touch China. And what we've discovered with these COVID lockdowns of the last 2 weeks is that the facilities are no longer functioning. So Apple has stopped. I have a phone that I ordered 2 months ago that was supposed to be delivered 2 weeks ago, and now I've received a notice that it's probably not even been built yet. They do have a facility in China with 100,000 people. And so, when that goes offline, do the math.
Yeah.
Now, this is not the death of Apple. They've got billions in the bank. They can rebuild their supply chain in other places. That's a 5-year process. So this iPhone that I'm trying to get is probably the last one for a while, until they completely rebuild their supply chain so it's China-free, because China is no longer a reliable manufacturing partner. And they're going to have to do that in places they don't have operations. You don't do that overnight. You don't do that cheaply. And Apple will be doing this at the same time other sectors are trying to do the relocation at the same time.
Sure.
Because of demographic reasons, we have an absolute cap on how much labor we have available in the United States. Same with Canada. Mexico is in a better position, but there's still an upper limit. So everyone who's trying to nearshore or reshore or friendshore at the same time has to compete for an absolute upper limit of labor availability. And we're now seeing that happen across the entire manufacturing world. Yeah, the smart firms started this process in the last year of the Obama administration. Now, maybe for wildly different reasons. And then it accelerated under Trump because he launched a trade war, and then it accelerated more under COVID, and now it's accelerated under Biden because Biden's even more economically nationalist. And now we've hit the wall. Mercantilism is basically what we're hitting. It's where you exercise a degree of trade restriction in order to limit people's access to your market, but you try to shove stuff down their throats to destroy their local industry whenever you can. Certainly the first part of that is going to be the norm for the next several years. The second part, we'll see what happens once the supply chains have been relocated. And I realize this is ugly. In the United States, this is 10% plus inflation for several years as we get all this stuff in place. Same in Mexico, same in Canada. But on the backside, we will have a supply chain system that employs people from the continent, that is simpler and shorter with fewer steps, that is cleaner, that uses less energy. And at the end of it, when it's done, we will have a supply chain system that is largely immune to international crises. And we're going to have record economic growth while we're building this. This is going to be a great story. High inflationary, yes, but people forget about the high growth part. Now, that's assuming you are affiliated with the North American network, as we basically take our marbles and go home.
I see.
If you are someone else trying to sell in, you've got to cut a deal, and there are not a lot of cut